today we'd be seeing how to avoid IP address conflicts in your network. And I'm Sharon Abraham. I'm your presenter for the day. A little bit about me. I'm a product expert at here ManageEngine OpUtils. I work in the IT operations management domain and specifically in IP address management. So I'd be walking you through the webinar today, and today we'd be looking at 3 important concepts, starting with a look into the modern IP address spaces. We'll then be discussing the most common causes of IP address conflicts that network admins can find in a day-to-day basis. And then the most important part where we'll be trying to understand how you can prevent IP address conflicts in your network in the most effective manner that's possible. So let's get started with a look into the modern IP address spaces. So what's something that makes it challenging to manage and to prevent IP address conflicts in today's IP address spaces? So the first challenge is something we both, you and me can completely agree on, which is the IPv6 complexity. Decades back, IP addresses were very easy to manage. You just needed a spreadsheet and a couple of ping tools or CLI tools to keep your network up to date with the current IP address space. But that's not the same scenario today. Today, the IP address space is getting much more complex, especially with the advent of IPv6. So you need to have an effective strategy in place that helps you monitor IPv6 in tandem with IPv4 without adding much complexity to your IT admin's day-to-day tasks. The next challenge, which is scale and visibility. So scale and visibility is something that is a part that needs to be a part of every network admin's IP address management strategy, because our networks are becoming increasingly distributed. They are not confined to one campus or one office or one data center anymore. We have data centers and remote sites across the globe, across the city, across the state. So when you have such a distributed network, it is important that you have a solution in place that helps you manage, that helps you have a visibility over your entire network at one place. That is a very important step in managing your IP address spaces more efficiently and more effectively. But that can be a challenge with traditional tools and outdated tools that do not give you the capability to scale your network and the capability to have complete visibility into your network. The next challenge is the impact of DHCP servers. Well, it is no news that our networks are becoming increasingly, reliant on DHCP servers. DHCP servers are something that, most networks cannot do without, because they help you in dynamic IP allocation, and dynamic IP allocation is something that makes the life easier for all of us who work with networks, right? So, but, when you have so many DHCP servers, it is quite important, and it is basically something you need to be in the know of. You need to monitor it. You need to know how the IP within the DHCP is utilized, who is using it, and how it is dynamically allocated. So there are several metrics that calls for a solution, not some traditional or outdated or a clunky old tool, but a modern solution that helps you manage IPs and DHCPs together. And then we have the challenge of different subnets and supernets. Networks today have multiple subnets, and with route aggregation, we have multiple supernets as well. So tracking IPs across multiple subnets and supernets becomes quite a challenge. You need to know how subnets are structured. You need to know what is the IP in a particular subnet overlap. How is the IPs utilized in different subnets? Because that helps you effectively plan your network. It helps you effectively also allocate resources. It helps you effectively run your IP address space. But that is a challenge if you do not have a proper IPAM strategy and you do not have a proper IP address management tool. We then have one of the most modern challenges, if you ask me, is the challenge of multiple IT admins in your organization. Organizations do not, are not very small these days. They are big, huge, humongous. And with that comes the IT admin team, which needs to manage these networks. So it's not going to be one guy, Dave, sitting in a corner office and taking care of all your IPs. No, we have multiple people managing multiple parts of your network address space. And with that comes the difficulty to assign the IPs to different IT admins and the difficulty to track who has access to what IPs. Well, that is the challenges in modern IP address spaces. So how does this challenge translate as a common cause for your IP address conflict? So how does this challenge, when not handled properly, becomes a cause of your IP address conflict? So for starters, what is an IP address conflict? Yeah, so IP address conflict is a term that we use to denote a scenario in your network where multiple Macs or multiple devices are trying to compete and get an IP and connect to your network using that IP. In a case such as that, we have scenarios where both the devices that are competing for an IP might lose network connectivity, or if you have an advanced device, then one of the device might lose network connectivity. So IP address conflict can be a very serious issue. While on the surface level, it tells us like, okay, the worst case is something, a device losing connectivity. But no, if this device is something that is critical, if it is a part of your critical network functioning, then it can cascade into much serious network issues. So we do not want that happening just because two devices wanted the same IP address, correct? So it is a serious issue. It can lead to degraded network service. It can lead to loss of network connectivity. It can reduce your network performance, and it can reduce the trust factor your end users have on your network. So it is important that we understand the cause of these IP address conflicts and proactively prevent them from happening in our network. So what are the common causes of IP address conflicts? Well, the first common cause is human error, which is a very classical cause if you ask me, because most network issues can sometimes be because of a human error. Our IT admins are very careful in their work. They are very committed towards giving the best quality to the end users. But sometimes issues such as data inconsistencies and manual IP allocation issues can easily cause an IP address conflict. For example, let's assume you are using a spreadsheet to manage your IP address space. In that case, if let's say an IT admin A takes an IP X and he statically allocates it to a device, but due to some there are some issues in your network and he's focusing on that, he forgot to update that he had actually allocated an IP statically in that spreadsheet. So now another IT admin comes in. He's like, okay, that IP seems to be available, or that's what the spreadsheet says. So he takes that IP and he again allocates it to another device. And that is a very easy and a very common cause of IP address conflicts happening in your network. So that's something we can all agree on. Human error can be inevitable without an IP address management solution like OpUtils, which helps you automate, which helps you easily mark the reserved IPs, which helps you easily manage your IP address availability and status. So it helps you avoid this cause of having human errors triggering an IP address conflict. We then have multiple IP admins. As we can see, the more hands on deck, the more performance we believe we can deliver to the end users. But sometimes it is important to have a clear distinction. So without a clear distinction of who's managing what IP, we can again have a scenario where two admins might assume a particular IP is theirs and they might allocate it to different devices. So this in different scenarios can easily trigger an IP address conflict in your network. For that, you need an IPAM solution that can help you give specific access controls to specific users who are using your IPAM solution to allocate IPs. If you do not do that, if your spreadsheet, which obviously cannot do that, so if your IPAM solution, your current IPAM solution does not allow you to create a role-based access controls or does not allow you to create user scoping, you are at the risk of this multiple IT admins managing the same IP space, causing an IP address conflict. So whatever IPAM tool you're using, please be sure you have the capability of creating role-based access controls and user scoping. So the next common cause is the allocation strategy. So when I say allocation strategy, I mean in networks, we have some legacy systems which are still useful, and then we have some critical devices which we think need to have an IP that needs to be only that devices and no other device should try and access it, right? So in that cases, we go and stick with static allocation, and we just let that IPs be a part of the other IPs in the network. So in the same network, we have DHCP servers. When we do not create a proper isolation or we do not mark the statically allocated IPs as reserved, then we run the chances of the DHCP servers dynamically allocating the static IPs to different devices. In that case, we have this clash between the two allocation strategies, which easily lead to an IP address conflict. So that's one cause. And the next cause is the DHCP server in itself. So this is something that is pertaining to the DHCP server. DHCP servers are great, they make our lives easy. But sometimes if we have a hardware error or some faulty configuration that is running in it, which might cause the scope overlap IPs or the different IPs in the server to be allocated in duplicated manner, which leads to an IP address conflict. So, that's why I've been insisting that the more the DHCP servers you have, the more important it becomes to monitor their scopes. The next common cause is the standby devices. This is something that has to do with the end devices in our network. So this cause is somewhat related to the system error within the devices. So for example, let's say we have a device A. So it has been using the IPX. Now for some time it uses the IPX and then it goes to a standby mode or a sleep mode. And it goes in such a long period that our network assumes that the IP is no longer in use. So it takes that IP and allocates it to a different device, say device B. So device B is now currently using that IP. At some point in time, if device A comes back live and there was a system error or the device simply assumes that IPX is the IP it is still going to use to access the network, there we have an IP address conflict just like that. So it is also important to carefully monitor what IPs are being allocated and how are they allocated, how is their transient period, and so on. And now comes a very tricky cause of IP address conflict. That is the external attacks. Not all reasons for IP conflicts is internal to your network. Sometimes it might indicate a malicious attempt to access your network. When external attackers are using techniques like IP spoofing, you can easily see an IP address conflict in your network if any device is using the same IP the external attacker is trying to spoof. So these 6 are the common causes we see in everyday networks that can trigger an IP address conflict. Now comes a little exercise for you and for my team as well. We'll be having a little acid test. I'd encourage you to currently think of your current IPAM strategy that you are using in your network. So think of it. I think you have a vague figure of what your IPAM strategy is, or even a pretty clear idea of what your IPAM strategy is. Now try and answer these questions with me. 1, is the data in your IPAM centralized? Is your IPAM data centralized? And do you have a centralized inventory to manage all your IPs? That's my first question. How is your IPAM strategy? Now, my second question, IP reservation. Do you have an IPAM tool that gives you the capability to mark your statically allocated IPs and exclude them from dynamic allocation? Do you have a tool that does that? Does your IPAM strategy do that? Now, my third question, overlap monitoring. How do you monitor the overlapped IPs in your subnets that are overlapping subnets and the IPs in your overlapping DHCP scopes? Do you have any part of your IPAM strategy that helps you to monitor these IP overlaps? Now, to the fourth question, your IT team and IPs. Have you enabled appropriate user access controls for your team to the different parts of your IP address space? Or does anybody in your team has access to any IP they want to? That's the fourth question. And the final question is, do you have an IP address management solution that automatically alerts you in case there is an IP address conflict in your network? Do you have any methods to instantly detect an IP address conflict before it can cascade into a major issue or before it can affect your end user experience? So these are my 5 questions, and I hope you had compared it with your current IPAM strategy. So how much did your IPAM strategy score? Do you have all 5 or just 2 or just a couple of the points we discussed? Well, even if it is not much, let's dive into the most interesting part and see how you can fine-tune your IPAM strategy in ways to prevent your IP address conflicts from happening in your network. So we are presenting to you a 3-step simple approach to make sure your network is well defended against IP address conflicts. So the first step is structuring your IP address space. And then we'll see how you're making, user scoping your different users, managing your IPs can be effective. And then the third step will be streamlining your IP request creation. So let's jump right into the first step. So we'll be seeing how structuring your IP address space should be. So before I explain this to you, I am going to assume that you have a IPAM tool, which is an IP address management solution deployed already in your network. If you haven't, well, please do not wait any longer. Take this as your sign. Go and download an IPAM tool. I'd suggest OpUtils. Go to OpUtils website, download their 30-day free trial, install it in your network, and see how this can be very effective. So we are going to be starting this step with the assumption that we already have an IPAM tool in our networks. Great. So structuring your IP address space. In your IPAM tool, check for these capabilities. Does your IPAM tool give you centralized IP inventory? If it does, make full use of it. Discover your entire IP address space, import it into your IPAM tool, and make sure you have complete visibility into your network. So it can be any subnet that is least utilized, subnet that is most utilized, whatever is it, make sure you have a centralized inventory. Next, group these IPs and subnets as required. Like I said, you might have different priorities of monitoring and management for different subnets. Not all subnets need intense monitoring, but there might be some subnets which you have to monitor every hour or every day. So group subnets accordingly so that you have a very streamlined way of sending in your monitoring efforts to monitor your subnets. Then reserve IPs that are statically assigned in your IPAM tool. This is very, very, very important. Like we've discussed this far, this helps you make sure you implement your static IP allocation and dynamic IP allocation effectively without any conflict. So reserve IPs that are statically assigned. Whenever any IP is being statically or manually assigned, make sure that it is marked and it is shown in your IPAM tool and in your DHCP tool. Next, track the real-time status of an IP. It is important that you know if an IP is used, if an IP is available, or if an IP is transient. This helps you effectively avoid scenarios where you allocate a used IP or a transient IP. So make sure you have real-time tracking capability in your IPAM tool. Now, in your network, it is important that we structure your IP address space. So how do you do that? When we calculate subnets, when we create subnets, there might be scenarios where we have overlapping subnets. So make sure you make a note of all the IPs in the overlap and make sure you put in right efforts in your IPAM tool to monitor these IPs. Next, check your DHCP servers for overlapping server scopes. If there are overlapping server scopes, again, make sure you know how the IP space is being utilized, how the dynamically allocation is affecting the overlap, and if the overlap is properly configured so that you do not have IP duplication in allocations. Next, exclude reserved IPs from DHCP server allocation pools. So in IPAM tool, whenever we statically allocate an IP, we mark it as reserved. We group it to be IPs that are to be statically allocated. Make sure you do the same in your DHCP server. Your DHCP server IPs should be structured in such a way that IPs that are statically allocated must be separated and must be avoided from being dynamically allocated. And the very important part is to note that you know which network admin has access to what IPs. Because when you do these steps in the IPAM tool and in your network, you are effectively structuring in your network. You are making it easier to manage. You are getting visibility. You are prioritizing your efforts, your management efforts into the IPs and the subnets that need most attention. So if you know what is the overlap, you are going to spend more time in monitoring those IPs. You're going to put in more efforts into monitoring those IPs. And if you're grouping them, if you're reserving them, it makes it much easier to avoid several issues like running out of IPs or issues like IP duplication and so on. So once you have structured your IP address space, we go on to the step 2, where we create user scopes so that users have access to only the part of the IP structure they should be accessing to. So how do you do that? Well, there are some advanced IPAM tools, for example, OpUtils. OpUtils has a capability called role-based access controls. So this is quite important because using this, you make sure that your IT team has access to only the parts of the IP address space they need to access to carry out their day-to-day tasks, but not the other parts of the IP address space which they might not need access to. So this way you are effectively preventing unauthorized access to different IP address spaces that might cause an IP address conflicts. So I'll give you a real-time example. So let's say we have an IT admin Dave and IT admin Mary. So Dave manages subnet A, B, and C, and Mary manages subnets D, E, and F. So sometimes when Dave has to allocate IPs, he's going to be allocating IPs from A, B, and C because that is the only IP subnets that he has access to. Because we have created role-based access controls in such a way that Dave cannot allocate IPs from Mary's subnets, which is E, F, and G or something. So this way, when different IT admins are being a part of your team on a scalable level, you make sure that your team, your operators have access to only parts of the IPs they need access to. So how do you effectively implement role-based access control? First, in your IPAM tool, group your IT users into administrators and operators. So administrators would be the folks who need complete read, write, and manage access. So select your administrators, select the resources they need to manage, and give them the complete read, write, and manage access. Now comes in the operators. The operators need to be configured with much more careful efforts because they might need read write access to one part of your IP address space, and they might read access to another part. So specify what level of access the operators have to what IP addresses and what parts of your IPAM tools management capabilities. For example, let's say we have an operator A. He can access subnets D, C, and E, and he can only use the IPAM part of your IP to IPAM solution, by which I mean the management part and not the reports. He can only manage your IP address space but not view the reports. Make sure you have user scoping that allows you to scope your operators control over your IPAM tool to only managing subnets C, D, and E. So he should not be able to view the reports. This is just an example. You can tailor fit this user scoping to however your organization is providing access to your IT admins. So in the first step, we saw how you should structure your IP address space. And in the second step, we saw how you should create access levels for your team to access the structured IP address space. So whatever parts of your IP structure they have access to, that is the only part they should be accessing. Now comes the important step. What if your network is scaling? So obviously your structure is going to grow. You are not going to be managing just A, B, C, D, E, and F subnets, and Dave and Mary are not going to be your only IT team. So there might come another person, there might come Marcus, there might come Luke, or whatever. So even your team is going to grow, correct? And as your IT department grows, as your IP address space grows, people are going to need more and more IPs. So make sure you still maintain control and visibility over who has what IPs in your network. This is where an important capability is required. The capability to streamline IP request management. So I'm going to take, again, an example of my product, which is OpUtils. So in OpUtils, we introduced a tool called IP request tool. So what this tool does is that when you have, a very structured IP address space in your IPAM tool, and when you have multiple IT admins accessing OpUtils to manage this IP address space, and when they want new IPs, they can log into the OpUtils tool. They can select what IPs they need from the subnets they have access to, and they can create a request. Now, the administrator steps in. he makes sure that your team gets the IPs they need. So this way, an IP request tool simplifies managing IP address space, and by allocating IPs to different parts or the different people who are requesting IPs and tracking the request status. So I think it'll be simpler if we have a look into this diagram that you see on screen. So how does IP request tool work, and how does IP request management work? So our first step is that we have a IP requester. So let's say he's an operator and he wants IPs from subnet A. He wants like 10 IPs from subnet A. So he creates a request in the OpUtils IP request tool, and that request is sent to OpUtils. Now OpUtils forwards that request to the administrator. So OpUtils essentially displays that request when the administrator logs into OpUtils. So now the administrator in his console can review the request. So if the request is something like 10 IPs from subnet A, if the IPs are something the administrator thinks that can be allocated, he can simply allocate it. Now, if the administrator thinks, no, I cannot be allocating you 10, but I can allocate you 5, or I can allocate you 5 from subnet A and 5 from subnet B, whatever that is, the administrator can edit the IP request. And once he accepts, or even if he chooses to completely decline the request, whatever action he takes, OpUtils notifies that to the IP requester. But in this process, OpUtils makes an important step. Whatever IP is allocated to whatever IP requester, OpUtils marks the status of that particular IP as reserved in its database. So this makes the whole process of separating the static and dynamic allocation much more simpler. It makes having multiple IT members managing your IP address space much simpler. It makes the whole process of having visibility into who's managing what part of your IP structure much simpler. So it's simply like an IP requester creating an IP request, administrator allowing the access, and OpUtils automatically marking that as a statically allocated IP, a reserved IP. So now, why should you invest in a tool that gives you the capability to streamline IP request management? This is an important part of preventing IP risk conflicts because it helps you streamline IP request creation and management, by which I mean the operators can create an IP request, view the status of their IP request, and view the previous IP requests as well. And the administrators can view logs of all the operators in the network. The most important part, the IP request tool allows you to centralize viewing and managing your IT team's entire IP request with ease. And especially it helps you integrate this, translate this based on the role-based access control you've set up. So an operator can only request IPs from the subnets he is authorized to access, and an administrator can only allocate IPs from the subnet he is authorized to manage. Then we have the process of automation, where OpUtils helps you automate the process of marking statically allocated IPs as reserved as soon as an administrator grants an IP request. And the most important advantage is that it helps you effectively rid your network of IP address conflicts. So this is our 3-step simple approach to helping you proactively prevent IP address conflicts in your network. So throughout this webinar, I've been telling you about OpUtils. So what exactly is OpUtils? Well, OpUtils is ManageEngine's most advanced IP address management solution that is simply powerful. It gives you all the capabilities you need to get started in just clicks. So you can get started in minutes. You have a centralized dashboard and widgets that help you centralize your IPAM data and manage it with complete ease. And you have the automated network scanning that makes sure you have the real-time data on your screen. We also have 30 plus network tools that makes lives easier for network admins because they have a comprehensive set of tools centralized to them whenever they need to carry out their day-to-day network tasks. You also get in-depth utilization reports that helps you understand how your IP address space is being managed and used. And the most important part, OpUtils gives you instant alerting. So you need not worry about an IP address conflict causing a ruckus in your network. Because OpUtils, if an unfortunate case you have an IP address conflict, OpUtils automatically detects it and alerts you. It tells you details like what IP is being the issue and what are the MAC addresses causing the IP address conflict, and you can immediately troubleshoot IP conflicts before they can cause an issue in your network. So it is much more effective. It helps you manage your IP address space, your DHCP scopes, and the switch ports. It also helps you secure your IP address space from rogue devices using a rogue device detection module, which helps you prevent intrusions from affecting your network. You also have the capability of role-based access controls like we discussed, and OpUtils has a mobile app that helps you monitor IPs from anywhere, anytime with ease.